Inside a small locked drawer in a private study at Buckingham Palace sits a small silver key. It is about the length of a thumb. It has no royal cipher on the head. It has no gold, no jewels, and no ceremonial engraving, just a plain worn shape, with one tiny carved crown at the top that has been rubbed almost completely smooth by generations of thumbs. The key opens a single door inside the palace, on a corridor most staff have never walked. That door leads to the private family archive, a small windowless room that holds every sealed letter, every private trust, and every personal family document that is not part of the sovereign's official papers. That key has not been formally handed to any member of the family since 1901. And last week, at just after 11 in the morning, King Charles handed it to Princess Anne. King Charles signed what has quietly been described as the final palace order of his reign. The document was a formal letters patent, prepared by the palace legal team over the last 8 months, that names Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal as Chief Royal Trustee, a historic office that has been dormant for well over a century. The role gives Anne formal custodianship of the private family archive, formal precedence in matters concerning the family's private legal, financial, and archival affairs, and formal authority to speak on behalf of the sovereign in any matter that touches those affairs during a period of the king's absence or reduced capacity. And then Charles did the unthinkable. Charles signed the letters patent in front of William, handed Anne the small silver key, and asked his private secretary to inform Queen Consort Camilla immediately, so that Camilla would not hear of it from anyone else in the palace. Camilla was left stunned, not because she had wanted the role, but because she had not known such a role still existed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Anne had been asked to come to the palace on a Tuesday morning. The princess had not been told the reason for the meeting. When Anne arrived, William was already in the small private study on the ground floor. So was Charles's private secretary. So was one senior palace lawyer who had spent the last 6 months working on the wording of the document. Charles was seated at a small writing desk, and on the desk sat a plain leather folder. Beside the folder sat the small silver key on a folded square of dark blue cloth. A letters patent, in plain words, is a formal royal document that publicly confers a right, an office, or an honor on a named person. Unlike a private letter, a letters patent carries the full weight of the sovereign's authority the moment it is signed. It is one of the oldest instruments still used inside the royal system, and it has been used at various points in the family's history to create titles, grant offices, and formally hand ceremonial responsibilities from one person to another. The role of Chief Royal Trustee had not been granted by letters patent since 1901. That was the year Queen Victoria died. The office had existed in earlier forms for at least 300 years before that, but no monarch after Victoria had chosen to formally revive it. Charles had spent the last 2 years quietly deciding whether to bring it back. That decision, in the end, had been made in the same weeks that Charles had signed his own final private wishes, and the same season in which he had begun quietly settling the family's long-term working structure. Anne sat down in the chair Charles had set out for her. The princess did not ask what the meeting was about. Anne had learned over many decades that her brother preferred to arrive at difficult conversations in his own time. Charles opened the leather folder. Inside was the letters patent, printed on heavy cream paper, with a small blank line at the bottom for the sovereign's signature. Charles read the summary aloud in his own careful voice. Anne listened without interrupting. William stood by the window, hands folded, watching the two of them. The prince had known the document was coming. He had, in fact, been part of the small circle Charles had consulted during the final weeks of drafting. William had not told Catherine the specific decision that morning, only that his father had asked him to attend a private meeting. Catherine had asked no questions. She had simply reminded William, before he left the house, that his aunt would need him to be steady in the room, not warm. William had understood the difference exactly. Anne felt surprise first, then quiet weight, then a settled kind of duty. William felt relief first, then respect, then a fierce, silent gratitude for the aunt who had, again, been asked to carry something the family needed carried. Charles felt love first, then fatigue, then a soft, private peace. Camilla, in a separate wing of the palace, was being asked by her own private secretary to be available for a short conversation later that morning, and Camilla, sensing something in the way the request had been phrased, felt a quiet, careful uncertainty that she could not yet name. According to a documented household account prepared for senior aides in the days that followed, Anne was seen to place both hands, very slowly, flat on the surface of the writing desk as Charles finished reading the summary. The account described it as a small, controlled gesture, the kind Anne made only when she needed a moment to steady herself. She did not speak for almost 20 seconds. Charles waited. William waited. The senior lawyer waited. Then Anne asked one question. The princess asked whether Charles was doing this because his own health was worsening. Charles told her the truth. Charles said no. Charles said that the decision had been forming for 2 years, that his current health was stable, and that the timing had been chosen carefully so that the transition would not be shaped by any medical event. Charles said the timing had been chosen because Anne had, in the last year, quietly proved every reason she had been given the earlier warrant. Charles said the chief royal trustee role was the natural next step, and that it needed to be settled while it could be settled without pressure. Anne nodded once. The princess did not respond in words. She simply reached forward, took the printed document from the desk with both hands, and read it herself, slowly, from the top of the first page to the bottom of the last. She did not skip a line. William watched her from the window. Charles waited without moving. The senior lawyer stood near the door with his own copy of the document, quietly ready to answer any question Anne might have. Anne did not have any questions. When she reached the end of the document, the princess folded her hands on the desk again, looked across at Charles, and said only 2 words. Anne said, "I understand." And then the story turned backward, because none of what was happening in that small private study could be understood without the 2 years of quiet decisions that had built the moment. The decision to revive the office of Chief Royal Trustee had not begun as a plan. It had begun as a question. Charles had asked the palace legal team, almost 2 years earlier, whether any dormant office existed inside the royal system that could, if needed, provide formal continuity of private family affairs during a period when the sovereign was unable to handle them personally. The team had returned to him within a few weeks with a short list of 3 historic offices. The office of Chief Royal Trustee had been the shortest, the oldest, and the least ceremonial of the 3. Charles had asked to see the paperwork. The paperwork had been kept for over a century in a small unmarked box inside the private family archive itself. It had taken the legal team almost a month to locate it. Inside the box had been 3 folded documents. The first had been the original grant of the office in the 17th century. The second had been a series of small amendments made over the following 200 years. The third had been the final formal grant made by Queen Victoria in 1874, which had lapsed after her death in 1901 and had never been renewed. Charles had read all 3. Charles had understood immediately that the office had been quietly waiting. The remit of the Chief Royal Trustee had, in every previous version, been the same. A remit, in plain words, is the specific set of tasks and decisions that a role is authorized to handle. The Chief Royal Trustee held custodianship of the family's private archive, formal responsibility for the family's private trusts, and formal authority to speak for the sovereign in any matter that touched those 2 areas during a period when the sovereign could not speak for themselves. The role was not a regency. A regency covered the wider state. The Chief Royal Trustee covered only the private, familial, and archival affairs of the family itself. Charles had considered the role privately for months before he had spoken to anyone about it. The king had discussed it with William during a walk at Windsor in the early spring. William had listened carefully. William had asked only one question. William had asked whether the role was needed or whether Charles was creating it. Charles had said, quietly, that the role had always been needed. Charles had said that the family had, for over a century, simply been carrying its work informally, and that too much of that informal work had been done by whoever happened to be steady in the room at the time. Charles had said that the role deserved a person, and that the person deserved a name. William had agreed, but William had also asked Charles to be careful about who he chose. William had reminded his father that the role would carry, in practice, a great deal of influence inside the family. William had reminded him that a role like this would need a person who would not use it for their own standing. Charles had smiled briefly and had told his son that he already knew the person. William had known in that moment exactly which name his father had in mind. Anne had been considered from the beginning. According to a private palace briefing shared with a very small circle of senior lawyers early that summer, Charles had told the team, in a short private meeting, that no other name had ever been on the list. The team had asked Charles whether he wished to consult Anne before drafting began. Charles had said no. Charles had wanted the drafting to reach a mature stage before Anne was told, so that the decision, when it was placed in front of her, would arrive as a completed proposal rather than as a burden she had to help shape. The drafting had taken almost 6 months. The palace legal team had worked slowly, carefully, and quietly. Every phrase in the earlier grants had been reviewed. Every ambiguity had been closed. Every phrase that could be read as expanding the role beyond its historic remit had been softened, so that the office would not, in any future generation, be used for anything other than what it had always been meant to do. The final draft had been reviewed personally by Charles in September, revised twice more, and finalized in October. During that same 6-month period, Charles had also decided to inform, very carefully, 3 other people. He had told William during a second walk at Windsor. He had told Sophie during a quiet cup of tea at Bagshot. And he had told his own private secretary during a routine morning briefing in late August. Charles had not told Camilla. Charles had not told Anne. Charles had not told Catherine. That silence had been deliberate. The role was a private family office. Charles had wanted the family's response to the moment to be authentic when it came. Sophie had asked Charles only one question when he had told her. The trusted confidant had asked whether Anne would accept. Charles had said he believed so. Sophie had asked why. Charles had said simply that Anne had spent her entire life accepting the work no one else wanted to do, and had done so without ever asking for a title on it. Sophie had said only in reply that Charles was, at last, giving the work its title, and that the family would be safer for it. Charles had thanked her. By early November, everything had been ready. The letters patent had been prepared. The small silver key had been retrieved from the private family archive and cleaned by a member of the palace conservation team. William had been asked to be present for the signing. Anne had been asked to come to the palace on the Tuesday morning without being told the reason. Camilla had been asked gently to keep her morning free, and Charles had spent the evening before the meeting alone in his private study, reading Victoria's 1874 letters patent one final time, so that he would know he was doing the same thing his ancestors had done, only in his own careful way. Charles picked up the pen. The king held it in his hand for a long moment, and the room felt every second of the pause. Anne watched him. William watched his father. The senior lawyer stood ready with the second copy for the palace archive. The private secretary waited near the door with a plain leather folder for filing. Charles then looked up at Anne, held her gaze for a full 3 seconds, and asked her one final question. Charles asked whether Anne accepted the office and its duties. Anne, without moving her hands from the desk, said one word. Anne said, "Yes." Charles signed. The signature was clean and unhurried. The senior lawyer added the formal palace seal to the bottom of the page. The document was, from that moment, formally in effect. Anne was, from that moment, the chief royal trustee. The office that had waited quietly for over a century had, at last, a person inside it again. Charles then reached across the desk and picked up the small silver key. The king did not place it into Anne's hand. Charles instead set the key back down on the square of dark blue cloth and slid the cloth toward her. Anne looked at the key for a long second. Then Anne reached forward, picked up the cloth in both hands, folded it in half around the small key, and placed the whole thing quietly into her jacket pocket. She did not admire the key. She did not turn it over. That was not Anne's way. The key was work now, not a gift. Then Anne said the one line that everyone in the room would remember for the rest of their lives. Anne said, "Some things were left waiting for the right hand. I will try to be it." The words were calm. The words were short. The words were spoken without any pride. But the words carried the weight of every decade Anne had spent doing quiet work for the family, and every year Charles had spent watching her do it. William heard the words and lowered his eyes for a moment, so that Anne would not see the small ache in them. Charles heard the words and felt at last the settled peace of a decision that had been forming for 2 years, finally landing in its correct place. And Camilla, still in her own suite, still unaware of what had happened in the private study, was preparing herself for the meeting with her private secretary that had, without her knowing, already begun to be redrafted. Charles then said something quietly, one sibling to another. The king thanked Anne. Charles did not thank her formally. Charles said simply that he had wanted to give her the office for a long time, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long to do so. Anne shook her head once. The princess said that the timing had been correct. Anne said the family had needed her to earn the office quietly for several years first, so that no one, when the office was granted, could argue against the person who held it. Charles said Anne had earned it many times over. Anne said she would keep earning it. William stepped forward from the window. The prince did not speak much. William simply placed his hand briefly on Anne's shoulder, and then on his father's arm, and then stepped back. That gesture, more than any words, closed the moment. William then quietly asked whether Camilla was still in her suite. The private secretary confirmed she was. Charles nodded. Charles said he would go to her personally. William asked to accompany him. Charles thanked him. That too was a kindness Charles had not expected, but had, on hearing it, gladly accepted. Anne remained in the private study for a few minutes after Charles and William left. The princess sat quietly at the writing desk, one hand resting on the leather folder that now contained her own copy of the letters patent. She did not speak. She did not move. The senior lawyer stood near the door, giving her the space. The private secretary waited outside, and Anne, for the first time in the meeting, allowed her shoulders to settle. She had accepted an office that would shape the rest of her working life. She had done so without ceremony, without applause, and without a single person outside a small circle of family knowing it had happened. That, for Anne, was the correct way. Camilla was seated by the window in her suite when Charles and William arrived. The Queen Consort had been reading a private letter from a charity when the knock came. She had known from the way her secretary had phrased the request that something significant was about to be shared with her. She had not known what. She had spent the last hour steadying herself for a range of possibilities and had ruled out most of them. Charles spoke first. The king did not begin with an apology. Charles began gently, with the fact. Charles told Camilla that a letters patent had been signed that morning, formally reviving the historic office of Chief Royal Trustee and formally naming Princess Anne to that office. Charles then paused to give Camilla a moment. He did not read the summary aloud. He did not offer the document. He told her in short, careful sentences what the office covered and what it did not. Camilla listened without interrupting. The Queen Consort did not raise her voice. Camilla did not argue. Camilla did not, at any point during the conversation, ask why Anne had been chosen. She understood from the moment Charles named the office that any question of that kind would have been a question about the wrong thing. Camilla had been in the family long enough to know that a role of this age had never been about choosing between people. A role of this age had been about finding the right hand. But Camilla was stunned. That was true, and Camilla did not try to hide it. The queen consort had not known, in all her years inside the family, that such an office still existed as a dormant possibility. She had not seen the earlier grants. She had not been told about the box in the archive. She had not been shown the drafting during the 6 months of legal work. And the news, arriving quietly on a Tuesday morning in her own sitting room, had reached her with a wait that took several long seconds to settle. Camilla asked one small question. The queen consort asked whether she should have been told during the drafting. Charles told her the truth. Charles said no. Charles said the drafting had been kept inside the smallest possible circle, and that the decision to keep it that way had not been about Camilla personally. Charles said the drafting had been kept small because the office itself required it. Charles said Victoria's own 1874 drafting had been done by only 3 people. Camilla accepted the answer. William then spoke. The prince did not offer any commentary on the decision itself. William simply thanked Camilla for the composure she had already shown, and said that Anne would be a careful custodian of the archive. William said that Anne would, in her own quiet way, keep every piece of the family's private history safe, and would do so without any expansion of the role beyond what the letters patent named. William said the office would not, under Anne, become a lever. That reassurance from William mattered to Camilla more than Charles had realized in advance. Camilla thanked William for that. The queen consort then said very quietly, "One small thing." Camilla said that she would need a little time to sit with the news, but that she would be steady by the afternoon. Charles said gently that she was under no obligation to be steady on any particular timetable. Camilla smiled briefly for the first time in the conversation, and said that she preferred to be steady sooner rather than later, because she knew that Anne would need to be able to work without any friction inside the palace. That small piece of grace was, in its own way, the most royal thing Camilla did that day. A private protocol, in plain words, is an internal royal rule that controls how sensitive matters are handled behind palace doors. A new one was drafted that same afternoon to sit alongside the letters patent. The protocol confirmed that all future access to the private family archive would require the chief royal trustee's approval, that all future private trusts held by the family would be registered with the office, and that any request from any member of the family, including the sovereign, to view archive materials outside their own personal papers would be logged and reviewed by Anne. The protocol was signed by Charles and William that same afternoon. Anne signed her own copy the following morning. Camilla was informed of the protocol gently, later that evening, and accepted it without protest. Sophie visited Camilla later that same day. The trusted confidant did not raise the events of the morning directly. Sophie simply arrived with a small basket of biscuits from a country baker, sat by the window with the queen consort for over an hour, and talked about small, ordinary things. That, in its own way, was one of the kindnesses that carried Camilla through the harder edges of the afternoon. The story reached the public through the smallest possible palace statement, released 3 days after the signing. The statement confirmed that His Majesty had, by letters patent, formally granted the historic office of Chief Royal Trustee to Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, that the office covered custodianship of the family's private archive and private trusts, and that no further comment would be made. The statement did not mention Camilla. The statement did not mention the small silver key. The statement did not need to, but the public understood. A broadcaster on the evening news framed the moment with one sentence that would circulate for weeks. "The king has just handed his sister the key to the family's memory." That sentence did what no palace statement could do. It gave the country the language for a role Anne had been quietly filling, in one form or another, for most of her working life. A tabloid headline read, "Anne given the key." A broadsheet led with, "The Historic Office Reborn." A Sunday paper printed a photograph of Anne walking briskly across a courtyard in her plain overcoat, with one line underneath. That line was, "The family's steady hand, at last named." The public did not turn against Camilla. That was, again, the surprise. Most people, when asked, said the office had not sounded like the Queen Consort's kind of role. Most people said Anne had been carrying the work of it for decades without a name. Most people said Camilla had handled the moment with the grace the country had come to expect from her. Most people said the family quietly looked steadier for the whole arrangement. Outside Buckingham Palace on the following Sunday, a small crowd gathered without any organization. There were no candles, there were no flowers, there were only a few handwritten cards left near the front gates. One card near the front, folded carefully in the middle of the small pile, carried a single sentence. It read, "Some doors were only ever going to open for you. Thank you for opening them." A man in his 70s told a reporter that he had been a junior civil servant in the 1970s, and that he had, on one occasion, briefly met Anne at a professional event. The man said he had never forgotten that Anne had asked him a real question about his work and had waited quietly for a full answer. The man said, before he walked away, that some kinds of authority did not need to be granted by a document to be recognized by the people who watched for it. But he said with a small nod that he was glad the document had finally arrived. Camilla attended a scheduled charity engagement 2 days after the palace statement. The Queen Consort appeared warm, composed, and, in the small ways cameras never quite capture, unhurried. Catherine attended a school visit the same week, and according to those who saw her that day, was in unusually cheerful spirits. Anne, when asked in passing by a reporter whether the new role would change her working life, simply said, "There is a great deal of paperwork," and kept walking. That answer became a small headline of its own. Charles gave no interview. The king simply returned to his desk the following week, and according to a private household briefing shared with a very small circle of senior aides that week, slept better than he had slept in almost 2 years. That detail was not written anywhere the public would ever see, but those who noticed it understood exactly what it meant. The world had watched a family quietly name something old aloud, and the world, for a moment, understood. The letters patent were placed permanently inside the palace archive by the end of the following week. The small silver key was returned, that same evening, to Anne's own private study at her home at Gatcombe, where she placed it inside a small locked drawer beside a framed photograph of her mother. The private family archive itself was quietly reorganized under Anne's supervision over the following 2 months, and every private trust held by the family was formally registered with the office. The new protocol was placed inside the same secure file as the letters patent, so that both would travel together into the future. Anne did not take credit for the office. The princess did not release a statement. Anne did not brief a favored journalist. Anne did not, in any conversation with any member of the family, refer to the role as anything grander than a duty. Anne simply began quietly to do the work that the office required. That work was steady, unglamorous, and, in its way, invisible. That, too, was the correct shape for a role that had waited more than a century for the right hand. Charles did not thank Anne publicly. The king did not need to. A short private note was sent to Gatcombe later that week. It was written in Charles's own hand. It read, in full, "The family is safer today than it was yesterday. Thank you for taking what only you could take. C." Anne kept the note in the same small drawer as the small silver key. She did not show it to anyone. William supported Anne carefully in the following months. The prince did not intrude on the archive. William did not ask for access to any private trust. William simply made himself available whenever Anne needed a second opinion, and stepped back the moment she did not. That, in its own quiet way, was the shape of the future working relationship between the two of them. Camilla kept her queenly status without any question. The Queen Consort continued her ordinary engagements. She kept every ceremonial responsibility she had held before the meeting. Camilla did not lose any part of her larger role, and no palace document ever suggested she had. What Camilla had learned, on that Tuesday morning, was that the palace was older than any single reign, and that some offices ran quietly beneath the surface of the modern royal family, waiting for the moment when they were needed again. Camilla had, in the difficult minutes that had followed, absorbed that lesson with grace. She would, in her own way, be steadier for having understood it. The lesson of that week was not about power. The lesson was not about status. The lesson was not even about the archive. The lesson was about a king who had, at last, given a name to work that had been done, quietly, by his sister for most of her life. Charles signed the final palace order of his reign, not because his reign was ending, but because he wanted the family to be complete before the next chapter began. Anne accepted the office not because she had asked for it, but because she had, in her own way, been ready for it since long before she knew it existed. And Camilla, stunned by the discovery that such an office still lived inside the palace, had shown the country something quiet and important. She had shown the country that a queen consort could be surprised by history and still meet it with grace. The final palace order has been signed. Princess Anne has been given the historic authority the family had been carrying informally for 124 years. Camilla remains queen consort, warm, present, and steady. William continues to prepare, in his own quiet way, for the reign that will follow. And a small silver key with a tiny carved crown rubbed smooth by generations of thumbs now sits in a small locked drawer at Gatcombe, waiting for the next time the family needs it to open a door. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.